The bar smelled like spilled beer and old wood, and Daniel Wren was 3 sips into a whiskey he'd been nursing for 20 minutes, when a hand, the size of a dinner plate, landed on his shoulder and turned him around. He didn't get a word out before his face met the counter. The impact cracked through the room, glasses rattling, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Someone gasped, a chair scraped back, and Daniel Wren, 41 years old, single father, mechanic by trade, stayed exactly where he'd been put for a full 2 seconds, forehead against the wood, before he pushed himself upright. He didn't shout, he didn't swing back. He wiped the blood off his lip with the back of his hand, looked at it, and then looked at the man who'd done it. Cole Baxter, local contractor, 6'4" of gym muscle and small-town swagger. The kind of man who'd never lost a fight because nobody in this town was foolish enough to give him a real one. Daniel rolled up his sleeve. If you've ever watched a bully corner someone he thought couldn't fight back, you already know how good it feels when he finds out he was wrong. Stay with this one until the end, because what happened in the next 30 seconds in that bar hadn't happened in this town in 10 years. And by the time it was over, Cole Baxter understood exactly how small he really was. 3 weeks earlier, nobody in Miller's Creek knew Daniel Wren's name. He'd moved into town in early spring with his daughter Emma, 8 years old, quiet and sharp-eyed, the kind of kid who noticed things adults missed. They rented a small house 2 streets back from Maine, the kind with a carport, instead of a garage and a yard. Just big enough for a swing set Daniel had built out of scrap lumber over a single weekend. He took a job at the local auto shop, fixing transmissions and timing belts for cash-strapped farmers and retirees. He kept his head down. He picked Emma up from school every day at 3:15, no exceptions. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He didn't talk about where he'd been before Miller's Creek, and nobody asked, because in a town like this, a quiet man who paid his tab and minded his business earned the right to be left alone, except for Cole Baxter. Cole ran a construction outfit that did most of the residential work in the county, and he'd built his reputation the way men like him always did, by being the loudest voice in every room and the first fist in every disagreement. He drank at the Blue Anchor most nights, held court at the same corner table, and had developed over several years a habit of testing new arrivals the way a dog tests a fence line. Daniel had been polite the first few times Cole needled him. Quiet, non-committal. That, more than anything, seemed to bother Cole more than an argument would have. Because quiet, to a man like Cole, looked like weakness. And weakness was something to be corrected. The bar owner, a heavy-set man in his 60s, named Walt Deakins, had watched the whole slow build with a kind of tired patience. Walt had owned the Blue Anchor for 30 years. He'd seen bar fights before. He'd seen bullies before. But there was something about the way Walt watched Daniel Wren settle onto his usual stool every Thursday night that suggested he was waiting for something. Not worried. Waiting. Because every Thursday night, without fail, 6 other men filed into that bar around 8 o'clock and took the long table near the back wall. Older men mostly, fit in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with habit. They didn't talk much. They didn't cause trouble. They nursed their beers and watched the door, the way men do when watching the door has kept them alive before. They never sat with Daniel. They never even nodded at him. But Walt noticed that Daniel always came in 10 minutes before them and never left until they had nobody else seem to register the pattern. Cole Baxter certainly hadn't. Cole saw a mechanic with dirt under his fingernails and a kid to feed, a man who flinched from confrontation, a man who made an easy target on a slow Thursday when Cole was 3 beers, past good judgment and looking for an audience. That night had started like every other. Cole had come in loud, ordered a round for his table, made a comment about Daniel's truck taking up 2 spaces in the lot outside. An exaggeration, since Daniel drove a 10-year-old pickup that took up exactly 1 space, parked with more care than most people gave their trucks in this town. Daniel hadn't answered. He just sipped his whiskey and kept his eyes on the television bolted above the bar. Some rerun of a ball game. Nobody was really watching. That should have been the end of it. Most men would have let it go. Cole didn't let things go. That was the whole problem with Cole Baxter. the reason 3 different subcontractors had quietly stopped taking his calls over the years, the reason his own crew turned over every few months. He needed to win, not the argument, the room. So he'd crossed the bar, put his hand on Daniel's shoulder, and introduced Daniel's face to the counter, which brought everything back to the moment Daniel stood up, blood on his lip, sleeve rolled to the elbow, and revealed the tattoo that had been hiding under his shirt for 3 weeks without a single person in Millers Creek noticing it. It wasn't flashy. No skull, no dagger, no dramatic lettering, just a small, precise insignia, a trident wrapped around an anchor, underscored by a string of numbers that meant nothing to most people who might glance at it in passing. But it meant something to the 6 men at the long table. Every one of them stood up at once. Not fast, not dramatic. They stood the way men stand when they've drilled the same motion 1,000 times before. A single unified movement with no hesitation in it, chairs scraping back in near-perfect unison. Cole turned toward the sound, and for the first time that night, something like uncertainty crossed his face. "Sit back down, Cole," Walt said from behind the bar. His voice was flat, final. Cole didn't sit down. He looked at the 6 men, then at Daniel, then back at the 6 men, trying to work out what he'd stumbled into and why the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees in the span of 3 seconds. The oldest of the 6, a wiry man with a gray buzz cut and a face like cracked leather, walked forward until he was standing beside Daniel. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at the blood on Daniel's lip, and something in his jaw tightened. "You want to explain what you just did," the man said, "to a master sergeant who carried 4 of us out of a burning transport with a dislocated shoulder and didn't stop moving until we were all clear." Cole's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "His name is Daniel Wren," the man continued, voice even, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "He commanded our unit for 6 years. He is the reason I have grandchildren. He is the reason this town still exists, though I doubt you know that part, since you were probably too busy overcharging people for kitchen remodels to notice what happened here a decade ago." Cole's eyes flicked toward Walt, looking for an exit from a conversation that had stopped being about a bar fight and had become, in the space of a few sentences, about something much larger than he could get his hands around. Walt reached under the counter and pulled out a framed photograph, the glass slightly fogged with age, and set it on the bar with the deliberate care of a man laying down a winning hand. It showed 6 men, younger, harder around the eyes, standing in front of the flooded remains of Millers Creek's Main Street, water up to their knees, sandbags stacked chest-high behind them. In the center of the photograph, unmistakable even 10 years younger, stood Daniel Wren. "There's a wall of these," Walt said, nodding toward the shelf behind him, where a dozen more frames caught the dim bar light. "Every one of them's got him in it, front and center, every single time." Nobody in the bar spoke. 10 years ago, Walt continued, the dam up at Cutter's Ridge failed during the worst flood this county's seen in 100 years. National Guard couldn't get here for 18 hours. Roads were washed out. Phone lines were down. We had maybe 200 people trapped between the water and the hills with nowhere to go and no way to call for help. He tapped the photograph. This man and his unit were passing through on a training rotation. They didn't have to stop. They weren't stationed here. They weren't obligated to anybody in this town. They stopped anyway. Spent 36 hours pulling people out of houses, off rooftops, out of cars, stuck in 6 feet of water. Lost one of their own doing it. The old sergeant's jaw tightened again at that detail, and one of the other 5 men, standing near the back, looked down at the floor. "We don't talk about it much," Walt said. "Wasn't for the cameras, wasn't for the medals. They came in quiet, did the job, and left quiet. Most people in this town wouldn't recognize him if he introduced himself with his own name on a name tag." He looked at Cole. "But every Thursday, these 6 men drive in from 3 different counties to sit at that table and remember the man who kept every one of them alive out there, and you just put his face into my bar counter." Cole's bravado, the thing he built his whole identity around, had drained out of him somewhere in the middle of that explanation. He looked smaller now, standing alone in the center of the room while 7 men, 6 veterans, and the quiet mechanic they just revealed to be something far more significant, watched him with an expression that wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was disappointment, laced with something like pity. "I didn't know," Cole said, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. "You didn't ask," Daniel said. It was the first thing he'd said since the hit. His voice was low, even carrying none of the heat that would have justified what happened. "Just fact, laid down flat. You didn't know anything about me," Daniel continued. "Not where I came from, not what I've done, not why I moved here, or what I'm trying to build for my daughter. You decided I was an easy target because I don't raise my voice in a bar. That's the only information you had. And you were wrong." Cole didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have helped him. The old sergeant put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, different from the way Cole had grabbed him, lighter, almost reverent, and looked at Walt. "Get him out of here," the sergeant said, nodding at Cole. "Before I forget what I promised my wife about staying out of situations like this." Two of the younger veterans stepped forward, flanking Cole without touching him, simply positioning themselves so that walking anywhere except toward the door required going through them. Cole looked at Daniel one more time, opened his mouth as though he might try an apology, thought better of it, and let himself be walked out into the parking lot. The door swung shut behind him. The bar exhaled. Walt poured a fresh whiskey and set it in front of Daniel without being asked, then reached across the bar with a bar towel and gestured at the cut on his lip. "That's gonna need a look," Walt said. "It's fine," Daniel said, but he took the towel anyway, pressing it against the split skin, wincing slightly at the contact. The sergeant, his name was Roy Castellan, though nobody in the bar, besides the 6 veterans, had ever heard it spoken aloud, pulled a stool over and sat down beside Daniel like they'd done this 100 times before, because they had in a different bar, in a different town, a decade ago, back when the 6 of them wore the same uniform and answered to the same quiet, competent voice. "You didn't have to let him get the first hit in," Roy said. "I know," Daniel said. "You could have moved. I know that too." Roy studied him for a long moment, the way old friends study each other when they're trying to read something the other man isn't saying out loud. "You let him hit you," Roy said slowly, "because if you'd moved it would have turned into something bigger. And you didn't want it to turn into something bigger. Not with your daughter's name on the lease 2 streets over." Daniel didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. That was the thing about Daniel Wren that the town of Miller's Creek hadn't learned yet, though it was about to. He didn't fight to win arguments. He didn't fight to prove anything. Every decision he made, every risk he calculated, ran through a single filter first. What would this cost, Emma? What would this cost? The life he was building for her, 2 streets back from Maine, in a house with a carport and a swing set built from scrap lumber. He'd learned that filter the hard way, in places far from Miller's Creek, where the cost of a wrong decision wasn't a black eye or a bruised ego, but somebody's life. He'd carried that discipline home with him and never put it down, not once, not even when a drunk contractor slammed his face into a bar counter in front of a room full of strangers. The other 4 veterans drifted back to the long table, and slowly, the low hum of bar conversation returned around them, though every few seconds someone's eyes would drift toward Daniel and then quickly away, as though looking too long might be an intrusion on something private. Walt refilled a few glasses down the bar, then came back and leaned on the counter across from Daniel, studying him the way a man studies a puzzle he's finally been given the missing piece to. 10 years, I've had those pictures, behind my bar," Walt said. 10 years, people asking who's in them, and I never had a good answer, because you never told anybody your name when you were here, and I never saw your face clear enough in the chaos to recognize you when you walked in 3 weeks ago and ordered a whiskey. Didn't recognize you either, Daniel admitted. Different owner ran this place back then, I think. My uncle, Walt said. He passed the bar to me 2 years after the flood. Kept the pictures up, because he said this town owed a debt it could never repay, and the least he could do was make sure nobody forgot who paid the price to keep it standing. Daniel looked past Walt to the wall of photographs, a decade of dust settled behind glass, faces frozen mid-effort, mid-rescue, mid-exhaustion. He recognized every one of them, though he'd tried, in the years since, not to think about that week too often. Not because the memories were painful, exactly, but because dwelling in them meant not being fully present for the version of his life that came after. The version with a daughter in it, with homework and dinner and a swing set built from scrap lumber. You could have told people, Walt said, would have made your life a lot easier around here. People respect what they know. They don't know what to do with a stranger. I didn't come here for respect, Daniel said. I came here because it was quiet and rent was cheap, and Emma needed a place that felt like it wasn't running from anything. Walt nodded slowly. Like that answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Running from something, Walt repeated. You running from something, Daniel? Not anymore, Daniel said, and there was a finality in the way he said it that closed the subject as effectively as a door swinging shut. He finished his whiskey. The cut on his lip had stopped bleeding, though it would bruise into something ugly and purple by morning, the kind of mark that would draw questions at Emma's school pickup line and require an answer he hadn't fully worked out yet. He paid his tab, same as always, exact change, and stood to leave. Roy caught his eye from the long table and gave him a short nod. Not ceremonial, not dramatic, just the kind of acknowledgement that passed between men who'd trusted each other with their lives and didn't need more than a nod to say so. Daniel returned it and walked out into the cool night air. He drove home with the windows cracked, the smell of rain still lingering from an afternoon shower, Main Street quiet and lit by a string of storefronts that closed at 6 on weeknights. He parked in the carport, careful, precise, the way he parked every night, and let himself into a house that smelled like the dinner he'd made 3 hours earlier. Pasta, garlic, bread, the kind of meal that didn't need much attention and left plenty of time for homework help. The babysitter, a teenager from 2 houses down named Sarah, was sitting on the couch with a textbook open on her lap when he came in. She looked up, saw the cut on his lip, and her eyes went wide. "It's nothing," Daniel said before she could ask. "Bar fight. Wasn't mine to start." "Did you win?" Sarah asked, half joking, the way teenagers do when they're not sure how seriously to take an adult's bruises. Daniel considered the question longer than the joke probably warranted. "Nobody won," he said finally. "Somebody just found out something he should have known already." He paid Sarah, walked her the short distance home, and came back to check on Emma, who was asleep in her room with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon casting soft shapes across the ceiling. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, the same ritual he performed every single night, regardless of what kind of day had come before it. Some nights, that ritual followed an easy day at the shop, a quiet dinner, an unremarkable bedtime story. Tonight it followed a bar fight that had ended with 6 strangers standing up in perfect unison, and a bar owner unveiling a wall of photographs that told a story Daniel had never planned on telling anyone in this town. He closed her door softly and went to bed himself, not because he was tired, but because morning came early, regardless of what happened the night before, and Emma needed breakfast, and the shop needed him at 8. And none of that changed, just because Cole Baxter had decided for one drunk Thursday night to remind an entire town what quiet competence actually looked like when it finally stood up straight. The story, of course, didn't stay contained to the 6 people who'd witnessed it. By Friday morning, half of Miller's Creek had heard some version of what happened at the Blue Anchor. By Friday afternoon, the version had grown 3 separate embellishments, including one that had Daniel single-handedly disarming Cole Baxter of a knife that had never existed. Daniel heard the exaggerations second-hand from customers at the shop, correcting none of them, offering no commentary beyond a brief, tired shake of his head. Cole didn't show his face at the Blue Anchor again. Not that week, not the week after. Word came around eventually that he'd lost 2 subcontracts within days of the incident, not because of the fight itself, but because the men who'd been quietly tolerating his behavior for years finally had a public reason to stop pretending they hadn't noticed it. And reputation, it turned out, was a fragile thing even for men who'd built entire identities on projecting the opposite. Daniel didn't take satisfaction in that. He noted it, filed it away, and moved on with the same steady rhythm he applied to everything else in his life. Emma noticed the cut on his lip at breakfast Friday morning and asked what happened in the direct, unblinking way that 8-year-olds ask difficult questions. "A man wasn't very nice to me," Daniel said, buttering her toast. I didn't do anything about it, and some friends of mine took care of it instead." "What kind of friends?" "Old friends, from before you were born. Are they nice?" Daniel considered the 6 men at the long table, the unified stand, the quiet authority in Roy's voice when he'd told Cole to get out. "They're good men," Daniel said. "That's different from nice, sometimes, but it's better." Emma seemed satisfied with that answer in the way children often are, accepting complexity without needing it fully explained, and went back to her cereal. That Thursday, a week after the incident, Daniel walked into the Blue Anchor at his usual time and found something had changed. The long table in the back had been pushed closer to his usual stool. Roy was already sitting there, along with the other 5, and when Daniel walked in, Roy simply nodded at the empty seat beside him. "Figured. It's about time you sat with your unit instead of pretending you don't know us," Roy said. Daniel hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and taking the seat. Walt brought him his whiskey without being asked and set it down with a small, satisfied smile. The kind of smile a man wears when a debt 10 years overdue finally gets paid, not in money, but in the simple act of a good man no longer sitting alone. "Wal's getting a new picture," Walt said, nodding toward the shelf of photographs. "Figured it's time we had one from after, not just during the flood." "Don't need a photograph," Daniel said. "Town does," Walt said. "So people remember what quiet looks like before they decide it means weak." Daniel didn't argue with that. He'd learned, over many years and in many rooms far harder than this one, that some battles weren't worth winning through words, and some truths were better left to prove themselves over time, the way water eventually smooths every stone it passes over, patient and certain, needing no explanation for the shape it eventually leaves behind. He raised his glass slightly toward the 6 men beside him, and they raised theirs in return. No toast, spoken aloud, none needed, the gesture itself carrying everything that mattered. Outside, Main Street settled into another quiet evening. Inside the Blue Anchor, 7 men who had once pulled 200 people out of a flood sat together at a long table, and, for the first time in 10 years, Miller's Creek finally understood exactly who had been living quietly among them all along. Cole Baxter, for his part, never set foot in the Blue Anchor again. Some said he moved his business 2 towns over, where his reputation hadn't caught up with him yet. Others said he simply drank at home now, alone, nursing whatever version of the story let him sleep at night. Nobody in Miller's Creek much cared which version was true. The town had learned something more valuable than gossip about a bully's downfall. It had learned that the quietest man in the room is sometimes the reason the room still exists at all, and that the measure of a man's strength is rarely found in how loud he can be, but in how much weight he can carry without ever needing anyone to notice he's carrying it. Daniel Wren kept working at the auto shop. He kept picking Emma up at 3:15. No exceptions. He kept the tattoo covered under long sleeves most days. Not from shame, but from habit, the same habit that had kept him quiet for 6 years, leading men through situations most people would never have to imagine. But every Thursday night, he sat at the long table in the back of the Blue Anchor, among men who understood exactly what his silence had always meant. And for the first time since moving to Miller's Creek, he let himself simply be known. Not performed, not explained, just known, the way a stone at the bottom of a creek is known by the water that's passed over it for years, shaping it slowly, patiently, until one day the shape becomes unmistakable to anyone paying close enough attention. Cole Baxter had never paid that kind of attention. That had always been his failure, long before he ever laid a hand on Daniel Wren. But the 6 men at the long table had. Walt had. And slowly, in the months that followed, so did the rest of Miller's Creek, one quiet Thursday at a time, until the story of the bar fight became less about the fight itself and more about the man who hadn't needed to win it to prove exactly who he was.